I still remember the day my own brother looked me in the eye and told me, "You don't own anything here, Mark." "This land isn't yours at first," I laughed, thinking he was joking. But when he slid the paperwork across the kitchen table, my stomach turned. My name wasn't on it. The very land my father had sworn would be divided equally between us had somehow vanished from under my feet. I sat there staring at those papers, my throat dry. My brother David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that smug little smirk he'd always carried when he who thought he was smarter than everyone else. He said it casually, almost like he was doing me a favor. "Don't take it personal, Mark. It's just business. That's what he called it. To me, it was betrayal. To me, it was stealing not just acres of soil, but years of sweat, years of memories, and the very promise my parents had built their lives around. My name is Mark Henderson. I'm 41 years old, born and raised in Oklahoma. I'm the son of a farmer, the grandson of a farmer, the kind of man who grew up with dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. I've spent my life believing in hard work, honesty, and family above all else. But on that day, I learned something I never thought I'd have to learn. Sometimes blood cuts deeper than any stranger ever could. Growing up, our land wasn't just property. It was life itself. Every fence post, every plowed row, every harvest was a part of who we were. My father used to say, "This soil runs in our veins," and I believed him. I believed David did too. That's why the papers in front of me hit like a punch to the chest. I wanted to shout. I wanted to demand answers, to flip the table and make him admit what he'd done. But instead I sat still, jaw clenched, heart pounding. Years of working emergencies as a volunteer firefighter had taught me one thing: panic gets you killed, silence keeps you alive. And in that moment, silence was all I had. The deal, as David explained it, was already moving forward. A developer had approached him about buying the land, our land, for a staggering amount. He'd cut me out quietly, hiding the documents, manipulating the process until, on paper, it looked like he was the sole owner. He thought he'd won. But what he didn't know was that while he was busy scheming in the shadows, the developer had already reached out to me too. And the number they put on the table wasn't just life-changing. It was enough to make my brother's smug little grin disappear forever. I didn't tell him that. Not yet. I just sat there, letting him believe I was powerless, that I'd lost. Because what he didn't realize was that the land he tried to bury me with was about to become my resurrection. He thought I'd been cheated out of my inheritance. What he didn't know was that I was already holding a deal worth $12.8 million. And soon, the betrayal would be his to swallow. My name is Mark Henderson, and before everything fell apart, I thought I had the kind of life most men would be proud of. Simple, steady, and rooted in the land that raised me. I was born and raised in Oklahoma, the second of two sons. My older brother David came into the world 3 years before me, and from the moment I could walk, I was chasing him across the fields of our family farm. Our father, a man of few words but strong hands, always told us that the land we lived on wasn't just dirt and crops. It was heritage. It was blood. "This soil runs in our veins," he'd say, pressing his calloused palm into mine. Our land wasn't vast by corporate standards, but to us, it was everything. Acres of wheat swaying in the summer sun, rows of corn that stretched further than a child's eyes could follow, and the old red barn that creaked with history. I grew up believing that this land wasn't just where we lived, it was who we were. Life on the farm meant early mornings and long days, feeding animals before the sun came up, sweating through harvests, fixing fences when storms tore them down. Hard work, yes, but it was the kind of work that made a boy grow into a man. And through it all, I had my brother by my side. We fought sometimes, sure. Brothers always do. But at the end of the day, I believed we were a team. When I was a teenager, I remember overhearing my parents talk about their will. They wanted everything to be fair, split evenly between David and me. 50-50, my father had said firmly. No favorites. Both boys worked this land. Both deserve it. My mother agreed, smiling at the thought of her sons carrying on the Henderson legacy together. That conversation stuck in my heart for years. I believed it. I trusted it. After high school, I stayed close to home. I worked odd jobs in town, firefighting, construction, even a little welding. But I always came back to the farm. David, on the other hand, was more ambitious. He wanted new trucks, bigger deals, a lifestyle that felt too shiny for our dusty roots. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. He was my brother. He could want what he wanted, and I'd support him. For the most part, we lived in peace. Holidays at the farm were full of laughter, with Mom setting out pies and Dad carving the turkey, while David and I argued over football scores. Neighbors would stop by, always remarking how lucky we were to have land like ours. And they were right. We were lucky. But looking back now, I see the cracks I ignored. David had a habit of brushing me off when it came to decisions. If a piece of equipment needed fixing, he'd act like my opinion didn't matter. If a neighbor offered to lease a few acres, he'd make the deal before I even knew it happened. At the time, I thought it was just him being the older brother, always wanting to be in charge, always needing control. I didn't fight it because, in my mind, the foundation of trust was unshakable. Blood is blood. Even when our father passed away, I held on to that trust. It was one of the hardest days of my life. Watching the man who taught me everything take his last breath. At the funeral, David stood tall beside me, shaking hands, giving the eulogy. We were united in grief, and I thought, this is what Dad wanted. Two brothers standing together, ready to carry the land forward. After Mom passed a few years later, the responsibility of the farm became ours alone. The will was supposed to make everything clear. Equal shares, I remembered. That phrase echoed in my head. I didn't even bother to check the papers back then. Why would I? David assured me everything was handled. Don't worry, Mark, he said. You've got your half. I'll take care of the details, and I believed him. For a while, I lived in that false peace. I kept working part-time in town, while helping on the land whenever I could. David seemed busy, always on the phone with someone, always driving into the city for meetings. I assumed he was handling things for both of us. When he showed up in a new truck, I thought maybe he'd just taken out a loan. When he started talking about opportunities, I thought maybe he was trying to expand. It never crossed my mind that he might be building a world without me in it. Because in my heart, I still clung to the belief that family came first. That my brother would honor our father's word, our mother's wish, and the blood we shed. For years, I told myself I was living the life I was meant to live. A steady job, some savings, the promise of the farm as a safety net. I pictured raising my own kids on the same soil where I once ran barefoot. I thought David and I would grow old together, two brothers carrying on the Henderson legacy just like Dad wanted. But the truth was already shifting beneath my feet. I didn't see the documents. I didn't see the deals happening behind closed doors. I didn't see how far David was willing to go to cut me out. And maybe that's the most painful part. Not that he betrayed me, but that for so long I believed he never would. He was my brother. If I couldn't trust him, who could I trust? For a long time after my parents passed, I trusted David completely. He told me the paperwork was handled, that everything was in order. I believed him because I wanted to. He was my brother. What reason would he have to lie? But over the years, small things began to gnaw at me. At first, it was little decisions he made without me, leasing a section of pasture, selling off equipment, arranging contracts. He'd mention it after the fact, always with the same casual shrug. Don't worry, Mark, it's nothing big. Then came the lifestyle changes. My brother had always been a practical man, wearing the same boots until they wore through, driving an old pickup with a busted tailgate. But suddenly, he was rolling up in brand new trucks, trading them in every couple of years. He started wearing expensive watches, taking trips out of state, talking about business ventures. When I asked how he could afford it, he'd laugh it off. Made some smart investments, he'd say. I wanted to believe him. I told myself maybe he'd gotten lucky, maybe he was better at managing money than I was. But a part of me couldn't shake the unease. Where was the money really coming from? It wasn't just the money, it was the secrecy. David started spending more time in the city, meeting with people he'd never told me about. He'd rush through conversations when I asked questions, brushing me off like a kid who didn't understand grown-up matters. When I pressed harder, he'd snap, his voice sharp. Why don't you just let me handle it? You're too soft for this stuff that stung. But more than that, it planted a seed of suspicion. One afternoon, I stopped by the county records office to renew a license for some equipment. While waiting, I struck up a conversation with an old clerk who'd known our family for years. He asked how things were going with the Henderson property. I smiled and said, still holding steady, 50-50 with David. The clerk frowned, shuffled through some files, and said, funny. I thought the deed only listed one name now. My stomach dropped. I asked to see the file, but the clerk shook his head. I'm not supposed to show anything without authorization. Maybe check with your brother. That night I did. I drove straight to David's house, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I asked him flat out, what's going on with the deed? He didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and said, don't worry about it. It's complicated legal stuff. You wouldn't understand. I stared at him, searching his face for the brother I used to know. But all I saw was arrogance. When I pressed harder, his smile faltered for a moment, then returned sharper, colder. Mark, he said, you've never cared about paperwork. Why start now? That should have been enough of a warning. But I couldn't let it go. In the weeks that followed, I started noticing more signs. Letters arriving at his house with developer logos on the envelopes. Phone calls he stepped outside to take. And then there was the day I drove past the south field and saw survey stakes hammered into the ground. Bright orange markers cutting across the land like open wounds. I pulled over, heart racing, and walked the field. Each stake marked boundaries, plots, sections. This wasn't just casual interest. Someone was preparing to divide and sell. When I asked David about it later, he brushed me off again. Just checking property lines, he said. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine. From that day forward, I stopped asking him questions. I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. Instead, I began quietly digging. I went back to the county office under the pretense of updating vehicle registrations. While there, I requested a copy of the property deed. The clerk hesitated, but eventually slid the folder across the counter. I opened it right there, hands trembling. My name wasn't on it. The paper that was supposed to bear both our names, a promise from our parents, a binding piece of our heritage, showed only one: David Henderson, sole owner. No mention of me, no 50-50, no inheritance. I remember the sound of my own breathing in that office, ragged and shallow. The room spun. My hands clenched the file so tightly the edges cut into my skin. How? When? Why? The clerk cleared his throat softly, almost apologetically. I'm sorry, Mark, but that's what's on file. I walked out with the copy, shoving it into my truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought it might crack. For years, I had trusted my brother with everything. For years, I had believed we were equals, partners, family, and in one piece of paper, all of that was ripped away. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the deed. Rage boiled inside me, but beneath it was something colder, sharper. Betrayal cuts deep, but it also awakens something dangerous. I didn't call him. I didn't storm over to his house. Instead, I poured myself a drink, leaned back in my chair, and whispered the words I never thought I'd say. He's not my brother anymore. And yet, even in my anger, a part of me knew the fight wasn't over. Because just as I was losing faith, just as I thought everything was gone, something unexpected happened. A letter slid under my door the very next week. A letter from a real estate developer. David thought he'd stolen my future. But when I opened that envelope and saw the number printed inside, I realized he had no idea what was coming. The letter from the developer sat on my kitchen table for hours before I opened it. I remember just staring at the envelope, my name printed neatly on the front. The logo of a company I vaguely recognized stamped in the corner. When I finally tore it open, I expected some generic offer, maybe a survey request, maybe junk mail. But what I pulled out made my hands tremble. It was an official proposal. The developer wanted to buy my portion of the Henderson land. And not for peanuts, not for a quick sale. They were offering numbers I'd never dreamed of seeing in my lifetime. The figure at the bottom was typed in bold. $12,800,000. I read it 3 times, thinking I'd misread, that maybe a decimal point had been misplaced. But it was clear as day. $12.8 million for my share of the land my brother had tried to erase me from. For a long moment, I sat there in stunned silence. On one hand, I felt vindicated. Here was proof that my share mattered, proof that the soil under my boots was worth more than my brother ever wanted me to believe. On the other hand, I felt a deep, searing anger. Because while he was busy, scheming, trying to cut me out, I had been sitting here thinking I was the fool, and all along the fool was him. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and leaned back in my chair. That's when the shift happened. Up until then, I'd been clinging to fragments of hope, hoping maybe David had made a mistake, hoping maybe the deed was some misunderstanding, hoping that somehow my brother hadn't really betrayed me. But holding that letter in my hands, I knew the truth. There was no mistake. There was no misunderstanding. David had taken what wasn't his, signed his name where mine should have been, and laughed behind my back. The land wasn't just dirt and crops anymore. It was leverage. It was power. And for the first time, I realized I had something he wanted, something he thought he'd already stolen. That night, I drove out to the south field. The sun had just set, leaving the horizon painted in streaks of orange and purple. I stood there in the dirt, breathing in the scent of soil and grass, remembering my father's words. This soil runs in our veins. For years, those words had meant family, unity, legacy. But standing there, I understood something different. The soil wasn't about David anymore. It was about me, what I chose to do with my share, how I chose to honor it or weaponize it. I didn't cry. I didn't storm over to David's house demanding answers. I didn't even call him. Instead, I pulled out my phone, snapped a picture of the survey stakes, and then tucked the developer's letter into my jacket pocket. I was done hoping, done begging, done believing blood was thicker than greed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a younger brother trailing behind, waiting for scraps. I was the man with the ace in his hand. Driving back home, my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Every lie David had told me, every smirk he'd flashed when he thought he'd outsmarted me, every time he brushed me off like a child. I replayed them all, but instead of breaking me, they fueled me. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, making lists, lawyers to call, records to pull, developers to meet. My father used to say, a good farmer plans for the season ahead. And that's exactly what I was doing. Only this time, the season wasn't about crops. It was about justice. I realized something powerful in those quiet hours. I didn't need to scream to win. I didn't need to fight him on his level. All I needed was patience, proof, and the will to act when the moment came. When the sun finally rose, I stood at the window with my coffee, looking out over the fields. They didn't look the same anymore. They didn't feel like home. They felt like a battlefield. And for the first time in my life, I was ready for war. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I started planning, because my brother thought he'd taken everything. But he hadn't taken me. From the moment I held that letter in my hands, my path was clear. I wasn't going to confront David in anger. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. If he thought he'd outsmarted me, I'd let him keep believing it. Because in silence, I would build something stronger than his lies, a plan. The first step was understanding exactly what he had done. I went back to the county office and requested every record with the Henderson name on it. Some clerks hesitated, but persistence is a farmer's greatest trait. I waited, I signed, I paid fees, and by the end of the week, I had a stack of documents that told the whole story. Somewhere between our parents' passing and the present, David had filed amendments, shifting the property into his sole ownership. He'd manipulated signatures, maybe even forged a few, and buried the trail deep enough that he thought I'd never go looking. But there it was, in black and white, proof that I had been erased. I took those papers straight to a lawyer in town. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in land disputes. I laid everything out on his desk, the deed, the amendment history, the developer's letter. He leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Mark, your brother's in trouble," he said. "If you've got proof of fraud, this isn't just a civil matter. This could turn criminal, and with the developer involved, the stakes are sky high." His advice was simple. Don't let David know what I had. Keep collecting. Build the file until it was unshakable. Then strike. So that's what I did. At home, I became two people. To David, I was still the quiet, younger brother, slow to ask questions, willing to nod along while he bragged about his business deals. I even congratulated him on his new truck, pretending I didn't know it was bought with money from the land he stole. To everyone else, I was the man digging trenches in silence, gathering every piece of proof I could. I started small, bank statements that showed, payments from developers to accounts I didn't recognize, meeting minutes from town councils that referenced the Henderson property as if one brother didn't exist, emails forwarded to me by a friend who worked at the county, hinting at shady backdoor deals. Each piece fit neatly into a growing puzzle, and with every addition, my anger sharpened into something useful. The developer's offer became my anchor. $12.8 million wasn't just money. It was validation. It was the proof that my share wasn't worthless, no matter what David had tried to make me believe. I called the company quietly, setting up meetings under the radar. The man on the phone was polite, professional, and very clear. "Mr. Henderson, your portion is critical. Without it, the project can't move forward." That was when the balance shifted. For the first time, I realized David wasn't holding all the cards. I was. I began separating my finances, moving savings into a private account. I updated my will just in case. I even spoke to an accountant about what to do with the money when the deal went through. Every step was deliberate, methodical. My father used to say, "A farmer doesn't just plant seeds, he prepares for the harvest," and this was my harvest. Meanwhile, I studied David. I watched the way he strutted around town, telling anyone who'd listen that he had big plans for the land. I noticed the way he avoided eye contact when I asked casual questions. I listened carefully when he dropped hints about meetings with partners, knowing full well he thought I was too naive to understand. And through it all, I smiled. I let him think he was winning. The hardest part was patience. There were nights I lay awake, the deed papers spread across my table, fury boiling in my chest. I wanted to drive to his house, shove the documents in his face, and demand he admit what he'd done. But every time that urge rose, I thought of the developer's number, $12.8 million. And I reminded myself that silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. I also thought of my parents, of my father's steady hands guiding me across the fields, of my mother's voice telling me to look out for my brother. They had trusted us to carry their legacy. David had broken that trust, but I wasn't going to let his betrayal destroy me. I would honor their memory in a way he never could, by turning his greed into my triumph. Over the next few months, the puzzle came together. The lawyer helped me draft responses to the developer, ensuring my rights were clear and untouchable. The accountant built scenarios for what to do once the money arrived, and the county clerk's office, without even realizing it, handed me the smoking gun. A file that proved David had knowingly omitted my name from a required inheritance document. That was the moment I knew I had him cornered. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I met with the developer in person, shaking hands in a glass office that overlooked the city skyline. They slid a fresh contract across the table, and I read every line carefully. When I looked up, the man across from me smiled. "Mr. Henderson, with your signature, this project is secured. Your brother can't move forward without you." I signed nothing that day, not because I doubted, but because I wanted timing on my side. I wanted David to feel safe a little longer. I wanted him to believe he had buried me completely, so that when the hammer finally fell, he'd never see it coming. Walking out of that office, the city lights glowing against the evening sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. For too long, I'd been the shadow, the quiet brother, the man left out of decisions. But now, every choice was mine. David thought silence meant surrender, but silence had given me power. And soon the same land he'd stolen from me would become the very land that buried his pride. He thought I was powerless, but while he was busy hiding papers, I was already holding the one contract that would turn his betrayal into my victory. The day David's world began to crumble looked just like any other. He called me that morning, his voice smug, telling me he had big news about the land. I let him talk, let him brag about his partnerships and business vision. He had no clue that while he was busy puffing himself up, I had already been in talks with the very developer he thought he controlled. I told him I'd swing by his house later that week, pretending to be curious, playing the part of the naive younger brother who still believed he had a place at the table. Inside, I was stone. The contract sat in my briefcase. The developer's number etched in my mind, 12.8 million. That Friday night, we sat across from each other at his kitchen table, the same table where years ago we had eaten Mom's pot roast and Dad's cornbread. But the air now was different, thick with lies and betrayal. David leaned back in his chair, sipping a drink, eyes glinting. "The deal's almost done," he said. "The developers love me. We'll be rolling in money." I nodded slowly, studying him. Then I reached into my bag and slid a folder across the table. "Funny you say that," I told him, "because they've been talking to me too." He frowned, confused. He opened the folder, flipped through the contract with my name on it, and his face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in years, David didn't look smug. He looked small. "They need my signature," I said calmly. "Without it, nothing moves forward, and I've already secured my share." He slammed the folder shut, trying to recover, but it was too late. The shift had happened. He wasn't in control anymore. The following week, we met at the developer's office. David walked in, confident, still clinging to the fantasy that he could talk his way out. But when the representative laid both contracts on the table, his and mine, the reality hit. The project couldn't proceed without me, and unlike David, I had everything in order. Proof of inheritance rights, documentation of his fraudulent filings, and a lawyer who was ready to pounce. David tried to argue, raising his voice, accusing me of betrayal. The representative raised a hand and silenced him. "Mr. Henderson," he said, looking at my brother, "your brother isn't betraying you. He's protecting his rightful share. If anything, you've been dishonest here." The room went quiet. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I just signed the papers in front of him, ink flowing smoothly across the line. When the developer read the final figure out loud, David went pale. $12.8 million. My share. Mine alone. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. But there was nothing he could do. Every trick he had played, every paper he had hidden, collapsed in that moment. The fallout spread fast. Word got around town. Neighbors whispered about the brother who had tried to cheat his own blood. Old family friends who once looked at him with respect now shook their heads. His reputation crumbled just as surely as his finances. But the real collapse came later, in court. I'd pressed charges with the documents I had gathered. Proof of fraud, proof of forgery, proof that he had manipulated records to erase me. Sitting in that courtroom, I listened as my lawyer laid out the case step by step, each piece of evidence another nail in the coffin of David's lies. He tried to defend himself, painting me as the greedy one, the disloyal brother. But then the judge read aloud the clause he had signed years ago, a clause that required both heirs' consent for any sale of the land. My name was missing, deliberately excluded. The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. Henderson," he said, looking directly at David, "you not only attempted fraud, but you violated the very will of your parents. This court will not protect your actions." The gavel struck. My rights were restored. My contract with the developer was validated. And David, he was left with nothing but shame. I'll never forget the look on his face as we walked out of the courthouse. He avoided my eyes, shoulders slumped, his arrogance stripped away. The same man who once told me I didn't own anything here was now walking away empty-handed, while I carried with me the knowledge that the land he'd tried to steal had become the very thing that secured my future. When the funds finally cleared, I sat alone in my modest apartment, staring at the confirmation on my laptop screen. $12.8 million. It didn't feel real at first. I thought about the boy I used to be, running barefoot through those fields, thinking the land was just soil and crops. I thought about my parents, who had wanted nothing more than fairness between their sons. And I thought about David, drowning in his own greed, undone by the silence he thought was weakness. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let out a long breath. Revenge hadn't come with shouting or fists. It hadn't come with fire or fury. It had come with patience, with silence, with carefully laid steps that led me here. The land was gone, but I hadn't lost. I had won. The courtroom went silent. I pressed my pen to the paper, signed my name, and walked out $12.8 million. Richer, he thought he'd buried me. But in the end, he buried himself. When it was finally over, I remember sitting in my truck on a quiet, back road, staring out at fields that used to feel like home. The courthouse papers lay on the passenger seat, the developer's contract finalized, the numbers still fresh in my mind. $12.8 million. It should have felt like triumph. It should have felt like victory. But what I felt most in that moment was relief. For years I had carried the weight of trust. Trust in my brother. Trust in the promises of our parents. Trust in the idea that family was unbreakable. When that trust shattered, I thought it had destroyed me. But sitting there in the silence, I realized it hadn't. It had remade me. The money changed my circumstances. Yes, I moved into a new home in town. Nothing flashy, just comfortable. I paid off debts, set aside funds for the future, and donated a portion to local causes my parents cared about. I wanted their legacy to live on in a way that wasn't tainted by David's greed. But beyond the financial security, what I gained was something harder to describe. A peace I hadn't felt in years. I no longer woke up wondering what scheme my brother was plotting. I no longer clenched my jaw when the phone rang, expecting another lie. The silence that once suffocated me had become freedom. That doesn't mean the loss didn't hurt. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any other. There were nights when I lay awake, remembering the boy who chased his older brother across wheat fields, the young men who stood side by side at our father's funeral. Those memories stung because they reminded me of what we were supposed to be, what we could have been. But then I'd remember the smirk on David's face when he told me I owned nothing. I'd remember the forged papers, the secrets, the arrogance, and I'd remind myself, the brother I thought I had never truly existed. The lesson I took away from all of this was simple, but powerful. Blood is not always thicker than truth. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who cut you deepest, and sometimes silence, patience, discipline, restraint can be the sharpest weapon you have. I learned that revenge doesn't always look like shouting matches or fists flying. Sometimes revenge is as simple as showing up with the truth in your hands and letting it speak louder than any lie. Sometimes it's signing your name to a contract while the person who betrayed you sits powerless across the table. Life after the storm wasn't perfect, but it was mine. For the first time in years, it was mine. I traveled to places I'd only seen in magazines. I took long walks without the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. I spent time with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I owned or what they could take from me. Every so often I still drive past the old Henderson property. The fields don't belong to me anymore, but I don't feel bitterness when I see them. I feel closure. Those acres may have been the battleground, but they weren't my whole life. My life stretched beyond those fences, beyond the soil my brother tried to bury me with. If you're listening to this and you've been betrayed by a friend, by a partner, even by family, I want you to hear this clearly. Their betrayal does not define you. It exposes them, it shows you who they really are, and it gives you the chance to decide who you'll be when the dust settles. I chose to be stronger. I chose to rebuild. I chose to turn silence into my weapon and patience into my revenge. David thought he had taken everything from me, but he didn't take my soul. And from that, I built a new life, not for him, not for revenge, but for me. Sometimes the people closest to you will bury you, but sometimes that burial is just the beginning of your rebirth.